Long before their names echoed through the chronicles of monks or the sagas of their descendants, the people we now call Vikings lived quietly in the northern corners of Europe. They were not born into legend, but into landscapes shaped by wind and stone, jagged coastlines, icy fjords, deep pine forests, and long dark winters. It was here, in what we now know as Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, that the Viking story began, not with conquest, but with community, not with war cries, but with whispers across the North Sea. To many today, the word Viking conjures an image sharp and narrow, ferocious raiders with horned helmets swinging axes aboard sleek longships. This image, dramatic as it is, tells only part of the tale. The real Vikings were more than plunderers. They were also skilled sailors, ambitious traders, cunning diplomats, patient settlers, and even delicate poets. Their lives were not defined solely by battle, but by survival, craftsmanship, kinship, and an insatiable curiosity for lands beyond the horizon. The term Viking itself carries layers of meaning and mystery. It did not refer to an ethnic group or a tribe. Rather, it described an activity. To go a Viking was to embark on a seafaring expedition, often for trade, exploration, or yes, sometimes for raiding. The word likely derives from the Old Norse Vikinga, meaning one who goes on an expedition, or from vik, meaning a bay or inlet, suggesting one who travels from bay to bay. To be a Viking was not a matter of birthright, but of ambition. Not all Scandinavians were Vikings, but many became so when the seas called, and the seas did call. The Viking world was a maritime one. Their longships, elegant, narrow, and astonishingly fast, were not just instruments of war, but vessels of wonder. With these ships, they could skim across open oceans or shallow rivers with equal ease, allowing them to reach places as distant as Baghdad and Newfoundland. Their journeys were not reckless. They were planned, mapped in memory and shared in tales. They read the stars, the birds, the currents, and the shape of the clouds. They navigated without compasses, using the sunstone and the rhythms of the sea itself. To the Vikings, the ocean was not an obstacle. It was a road. Yet what drove them to take to the waves in the first place? It was a confluence of pressures and possibilities. Scandinavia, while stunning, offered limited arable land. As populations grew and chieftains competed, younger sons found fewer prospects at home. At the same time, Europe was becoming increasingly wealthy, fragmented, and vulnerable. Coastal monasteries and riverfront cities offered both opportunity and temptation, goods to trade, riches to seize, and stories to carry home. But not all who left Scandinavia sought gold at the tip of a blade. Many came with families, seeds, and hopes of founding something new. They built farms in Iceland, villages in Ireland, and trade routes along the rivers of Russia. Their legacy is not one of destruction alone, but of connection. To understand the Vikings, one must listen not just to the battle horns, but to the quieter notes of their lives. The creak of wood underfoot as a longship leaves harbour, the laughter around a hearth in a smoky longhouse, the carving of runes into stone, the chanting of old sagas under stars. These were people of contrasts, fierce yet poetic, restless yet rooted in family and clan. They believed in fate, in honor, and in the power of the spoken word. Their gods walked among them, and their dead sailed into the afterlife on burning ships. This is a story not just of war, but of wonder, not just of power, but of poetry. As we journey through the chapters ahead, we will follow the Vikings from their misty origins to their far-flung settlements, from blood-stained battlefields to quiet workshops, from the myths they told to the worlds they shaped. Along the way, we'll try to peel back the centuries of legend and rediscover the humans behind the helmets, the fathers, mothers, daughters, and sons who lived between forest and fjord, and who, for a time, changed the course of history. So settle in, and let the whispers of the North Sea carry you back to a time of drifting ships and drifting stories, of cold wind and warm fires, of gods and ghosts, of trade and terror. Back to the Viking Age, not as we've imagined it in fragments and fear, but as it truly was, a story of wind, wood, and wandering far from home. Long before the world came to know the sleek silhouettes of Viking longships gliding over icy waves, the lands of Scandinavia were home to a people quietly shaping a culture rooted in resilience. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 976 CE, much of Europe stumbled into what would later be called the early Middle Ages, a time of shifting powers, fading roads, and forgotten cities. But north of the Roman frontier, in the remote peninsulas and archipelagos of what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the Nordic tribes were living lives largely untouched by the rhythms of empire. Here, in a colder and more rugged world, civilization did not collapse. It took a different form altogether. The lands of Scandinavia were not empty, far from it. As early as the late Bronze Age, communities had clustered along fjords and valleys, trading amber and furs, crafting tools, and raising burial mounds that still rise like frozen waves across the landscape. By the start of the early Iron Age, around 200 CE, these settlements had become more defined. Archaeological finds tell us of modest villages where families worked together to tend fields, raise livestock, and forge iron from bog ore. Their houses were long and narrow, often shared with animals in winter for warmth. Life was communal, harsh, and deeply in tune with the seasons. Unlike the centralized empires to the south, post-Roman Scandinavia was a mosaic of clan-based societies. Power rested with local chieftains, men who gained their authority not by birthright alone, but through strength, generosity, and reputation. These leaders ruled over small territories and were bound to their people through a web of loyalty, gift-giving, and feasting. Honor was everything. To insult a man's family or reputation was to invite vengeance. There were no kings in the early centuries, only many lords, each holding sway over a stretch of land, a patch of coast, or a cluster of farms. Communication between tribes was slow, but it existed. Seasonal gatherings such as regional things, open-air assemblies for trade, law-making, and social bonding brought scattered communities together. These early political structures foreshadowed the later more formal councils and legal codes of Viking society. Though there was no unified Scandinavian identity yet, a shared language, oral tradition, and belief system helped create a cultural kinship across the region. The natural world played a central role in daily life and belief. Dense forests, misty lakes and snow-covered peaks were not just obstacles, they were alive with meaning. Spirits and unseen forces were thought to inhabit the land. Weather was a message, the sea a gatekeeper, and animals were seen as omens or guides. Spiritual life in this era did not yet have the formal pantheon of later Norse mythology, but the seeds were there. Ancestors were honored in burial mounds, sacred groves were respected, and offerings were made to placate forces beyond human control. Seafaring, too, was not a Viking innovation. It was a Nordic inheritance. Even in the early Iron Age, communities along the coast and in the inland lakes used wooden boats to travel, fish, and trade. These were not the dragon-proud warships of later centuries, but smaller, simpler vessels built from local pine and oak. Still, they were enough to carry men and goods across rivers, fjords, and even the open sea. Through these quiet crossings, connections were forged not only between Scandinavian tribes, but with the wider world. Trade routes extended south into continental Europe and east toward the Baltic. Baltic amber, Scandinavian furs, and carved bone tools were exchanged for glass, metal, and rare pigments. Roman coins, found buried in Scandinavian soil, hint at contacts that went deeper than simple curiosity. Even as the Roman Empire fell into ruin, its echoes still drifted northward, carried not by legions but by traders, sailors, and stories. By 700 CE, the foundations of the Viking world were in place. A hardened people, skilled in survival and deeply attached to land and kin, stood ready for what came next. They had developed the tools, the knowledge of the sea, and the oral traditions that would shape the Viking Age. What they lacked was a spark, something to push them from quiet independence into expansive ambition. That spark would come soon. But for now, in the centuries before the Longships cast their shadows on foreign shores, Scandinavia was a land in slow motion. A place of snow and silence, of firelight tales and shared meals, of axes and soil. A world where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons, and the horizon was not yet a call to conquest, but a distant line to wonder about. This was the world before the Vikings, raw, rooted, and ready. To picture Scandinavia in the centuries just before the Viking Age is to imagine a latticework of fjords and valleys where every inlet sheltered a handful of long timber dwellings and every forest clearing echoed with stories of kin, spirit, and sea. Power, such as it was, rested not in marble palaces or walled citadels, but in the mead halls of clan chiefs, petty kings whose strength was measured by the loyalty they could inspire, the generosity they could afford, and the justice they could dispense. These leaders bore no jeweled crowns. Instead, they carried the weight of reputation. A chieftain's good name was silver in the mind, and like silver it could be traded or tarnished, hoarded or squandered. Councils, things, met beneath open skies, where men and sometimes women stood in ringed assemblies, settled quarrels with oaths and fines, and recited laws so old they felt grown from the earth itself. Daily life revolved around the extended family, or ett, bound together by blood, fosterage, and sworn friendship. Each farmstead functioned like a tiny kingdom. Fields of barley and rye hugging the house, cattle and sheep crowding winter byres, smoke curling from turf-covered roofs. In summer, hay meadows thrummed with scythes. In winter, looms beat out, woolen cloth beside the hearth. Births, marriages and deaths were marked by shared feasts where rune-carved drinking horns passed from hand to hand, and the deeds of ancestors were celebrated to remind every listener that personal honor stretched backward as well as forward in time. Yet these people did not see the landscape as mere backdrop. Groves were holy, hills were watchful, stones whispered. Spirits, Landvettir, dwelt in waterfall mists and the roots of ancient pines. Offerings of grain or the first cut of meat were quietly left on flat rocks, while more solemn sacrifices, sometimes a prized horse, sometimes a captured enemy, took place at seasonal gatherings. There existed no single priesthood. Instead, household heads and wandering velour seeresses mediated between human needs and unseen wills. A vulva, wrapped in blue wool and silver bead chains, might arrive unannounced, staff in hand, to chant prophecies that mingled practical advice with glimpses of fate, reminding every listener that life and death rode the same wind. If land anchored identity, the sea stirred imagination. Even in this pre-Viking era, Scandinavian boat builders were perfecting clinker construction. Overlapped planks riveted tight, a flexible spine of oak ribs, and a shallow keel that let a vessel slip from surf to river without pause. These early craft, it would be generous to call them proto-longships, carried fishers beyond sight of shore and traders across the Skagerrak to markets in Frisia or the British Isles. A young farmhand might join his uncle on such a journey, returning months later with glass beads from Frankish workshops or bronze balance scales to weigh silver by the ounce. Tales of distant coasts, foreign gods, and manor churches of stone were poured out during winter evenings, feeding a slow-burning curiosity that would, in the next century, ignite into full-fledged exploration. Without parchment or pen, memory itself was the library of the North. Poets, skalds, prized sharp tongues and keener ears. They wove alliteration and rhythm into sagas that travelled farther than any ship. Stories of heroes who challenged frost giants, lovers who defied clan feuds, and tricksters who reminded even kings that wit can unseat muscle. These oral tapestries served many roles at once: entertainment, genealogy, moral compass, map of the cosmos. In their verses, the sky was Ymir's fractured skull, the sun a spark drawn by horse team across an iron vault, and the end of days, Ragnarök, a certainty that lent urgency to every mortal deed. When elders spoke these tales to children drifting toward sleep beside embers, they were doing more than passing time. They were tempering spirits for storms, both literal and figurative. Together, clan politics, spiritual traditions, seafaring, habits and mythic lore formed an alloy stronger than any singly wrought chain. They created communities nimble enough to adapt, yet cohesive enough to stand their ground, teaching the virtues of bravery, reciprocity, and keen observation of nature. Over generations, incremental innovations, stronger rivets, broader sails, iron ploughshares, better smithing of sword hilts, accumulated like kindling beneath a great pyre. What remained was the decisive spark, rising populations, shifting climate, and news brought by sailors of undefended wealth in monasteries lying just beyond the western horizon. Thus, the groundwork for the Viking Age was laid not by a sudden revelation, but by centuries of quiet practice. The petty kings and their loyal hearthguard already understood the value of seasonal raiding against neighboring valleys. The skalds had long rehearsed praise for those who returned with silver. The voleur had foretold that fame was better than gold, for it outlived the flesh. When the first true longships finally nosed into foreign surf, their crews carried with them more than axes. They bore an entire way of seeing the world, that honor could be won abroad, that the sea was a road, and that destiny favored the bold. In this sense, every silent offering at a forest altar, every story repeated beneath storm rafters, and every experimental plank hammered into a fishing craft had been rehearsal. The stage for the Viking Age stood prepared, awaiting only the opening beat of oars against cold, midnight water. The year was 793. The sea was calm, the horizon still. Off the northeastern coast of what is now England, on a small tidal island called Lindisfarne, the monks of a quiet Christian monastery went about their devotions in peace. The island, known also as Holy Island, had been a centre of learning and worship for generations. Founded by St. Aidan and blessed by the legacy of St. Cuthbert, Lindisfarne held not only precious relics and illuminated manuscripts, but also the quiet hopes of a fragile and growing Christian faith in the British Isles. And then, without warning, the sky darkened, not with clouds, but with sails. The longships came swiftly, cutting through the waters like knives. The raiders poured ashore, fierce and sudden, armed with axes and foreign tongues. They struck not for conquest, but for plunder. The holy place, unfortified and unsuspecting, was ravaged. The altar was overturned, treasures stolen, monks slaughtered or taken as slaves. In hours, a sanctuary that had stood for decades was reduced to ruin, its peace shattered by men the Christian world had never seen before. This was the first recorded Viking raid on Western Christendom, and it marked the beginning of an age that would shake the very foundations of medieval Europe. Though there had likely been earlier, smaller incursions along the coastlines, it was Lindisfarne that made the world take notice. The attack was not only a physical blow, it was a psychological one. The idea that holy ground could be desecrated so easily shocked the Christian imagination. It was as if the rules of the known world had been broken. The response across Christian Europe was swift and anguished. Alcuin of York, a learned monk and advisor to Charlemagne, wrote with horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God." His words reflect the spiritual panic of the time. This was not merely an act of theft or violence, it was seen as a divine judgment, a punishment for the sins of the people or the moral failings of leaders. Many believed the attack had cosmic implications, signaling chaos unleashed at the edge of the known world. But to the Scandinavians who launched the raid, Lindisfarne was not a sacred site. It was a storehouse of silver, food, and unguarded wealth. The ornate chalices, golden crosses, and silken vestments meant for glorifying the Christian God were to the raiders simply treasure. They did not yet grasp, or perhaps did not care, about the symbolic weight of their actions. What they understood was that this place was soft, rich, and unprotected, and there were surely more like it. In the years that followed, other coastal communities would come to know the same fear. Monasteries in Jarrow and Iona would be burned, villages along the Irish coast sacked, and the once familiar rhythm of life disrupted by the looming threat of sails on the horizon. The term Viking itself would come to embody not just a people, but a terror, a seaborne storm that arrived without warning, struck with precision, and vanished into the mist. But Lindisfarne was the first. It marked the beginning of what historians now call the Viking Age, a period stretching from the late 8th to the mid-11th century, during which Norsemen from Scandinavia raided, traded, settled, and transformed vast swaths of Europe. It is no coincidence that this age began with a monastery. For the Vikings, monasteries were perfect targets, isolated, wealthy, and deeply symbolic to their enemies. For Christian Europe, these attacks felt like assaults not just on property, but on faith itself. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred, a realization. The North, once seen as a distant and unthreatening frontier, was home to people who were skilled, mobile, and fearless. Their ships could cross oceans. Their warriors moved quickly and struck hard, and their motives were not always as simple as greed. In time, the Viking story would become far more complex, filled not just with raids, but with trade, settlement, and cultural exchange. But in 793, none of that was yet visible. All that remained in the minds of those who survived Lindisfarne was the sound of screams, the clash of iron, and the fading image of longships sliding back into the sea. The shock of Lindisfarne would echo for decades. It was more than an event. It was a signal. A new force had entered the stage of history. One that would not only reshape the map of Europe, but challenge its faith, its politics, and its very sense of security. The Viking Age had begun. To understand why the Vikings erupted so suddenly onto the stage of European history, one must look beyond the blood-streaked stones of Lindisfarne and into the silent pressures building within Scandinavia itself. The raid on the monastery in Chitars, 793, was not an isolated explosion of violence. It was the spark igniting a long-fused build-up of need, opportunity, and innovation. The reasons the Vikings set sail for foreign shores are many and intertwined. Demographic tension at home, alluring wealth abroad, political rivalries among petty rulers, and a revolution in shipbuilding that made the impossible suddenly achievable. Scandinavia in the 8th century was not barren or primitive, it was full of life. But that vitality carried consequences. The land, while vast, offered limited fertile ground. The soil was thin in many areas, the growing season short, and resources like timber, fish, and iron had to be carefully managed. As populations gradually grew, pressure mounted on family farms to divide and subdivide land among heirs. In time, this meant younger sons, those not destined to inherit, found themselves with few prospects. They could serve a local chieftain, seek alliances through marriage, or they could take to the sea. Overpopulation, while relative in modern terms, was enough to create a restless undercurrent in Nordic society. Raiding was not merely a pastime, it was an economic necessity for many. A successful expedition could enrich not only the warrior, but his kin and community. The spoils of even a modest raid, a chest of silver, foreign tools, exotic cloth, could shift the balance of power in a small village or elevate the status of a minor lord, but it was not only scarcity that fueled Viking ambition, it was also envy. Across the sea, within reach of a strong sail and a brave crew, lay lands rich with churches, gold, and undefended monasteries. For centuries, merchants had moved through the North Sea and Baltic, carrying tales of glittering chalices, stuffed granaries, and kings who stored wealth in stone-walled abbeys guarded only by prayer. To a Norse chieftain weighing his options, these were not just stories, they were maps of opportunity. Wealth abroad, therefore, acted like gravity. The kingdoms of England, Francia, and Ireland were politically fragmented, their coasts long and difficult to patrol. Monasteries in particular made tempting targets, not only for their treasures, but for their symbolic importance. To a people who did not yet follow the Christian faith, these institutions were not sacred, they were poorly defended storehouses, and attacking them sent a message. The North had awoken. Compounding the drive for resources and treasure were the tangled rivalries within Scandinavia itself. The pre-Viking world was not a peaceful or united place. Dozens of petty kings ruled patches of land no larger than modern counties. Alliances were fluid, feuds constant, and status everything. Raiding became both a means of gaining wealth and a way of proving legitimacy. A chieftain who could lead a successful raid, return with spoils and distribute them generously won loyalty, and with loyalty came power. In this sense, Viking expansion was a political act as much as an economic one. Yet none of this would have been possible without one key development, the evolution of the Viking ship. The longship was not born overnight. It was the product of generations of craftsmanship, honed by fishermen, traders, and coastal dwellers who knew the sea intimately. The Viking longship, with its shallow draft, flexible hull, and symmetrical design, was revolutionary. It could travel up rivers, cross open seas, and be hauled overland if needed. Built from overlapping planks, clinker-built, and reinforced with iron rivets, these ships were light, fast, and strong. A single vessel could carry dozens of warriors at speeds far beyond those of traditional transport boats. The real genius, however, was in its versatility. With both sail and oar, longships could maneuver in almost any condition. They required no harbours and could land on any beach. This meant Viking raiders were not limited to known ports or predictable routes. They could appear anywhere, vanishing as swiftly as they came. For coastal communities unprepared for such mobility, the psychological impact was enormous. One could not defend against what could not be predicted. And so the daring sea raids began, swift, brutal, and effective. What started at Lindisfarne in 793 became, over the following decades, a pattern repeated from the Shetlands to the Seine. Villages were burned, towns plundered, and sometimes, when the land proved especially rich, settlements were founded. The Vikings were no longer just farmers or fishermen. They had become something new, part warrior, part explorer, part opportunist. Their sails marked not only an era of violence but one of cultural encounter, migration, and exchange. In the end, the Viking Age did not begin simply because of greed or cruelty. It began because the forces of population, ambition, technology, and political desire all collided at once, urging a restless people to leave their shores and challenge the world beyond. When people picture Vikings riding the waves, they often imagine axe-wielding raiders leaping from longships in a spray of seawater and fear. Yet those sleek vessels carried more than warriors. They ferried craftsmen, farmers, and shrewd merchants whose ambitions stretched far beyond plunder. In truth, the Viking Age was a tapestry of motives. For every crew that set off to raid a monastery, another group loaded barrels of furs, amber, and iron tools, steering toward bustling trade fairs. And for many who crossed the sea, the aim was not gold at the edge of a blade, but good soil underfoot, a chance to build new homes in distant lands. Across Scandinavia and the Baltic Rim, growing networks of exchange began transforming coastal villages into cosmopolitan hubs. 3 sites in particular, Hedeby, Birka, and Kopang, rose from modest harbours to become vibrant marketplaces where goods, languages, and beliefs converged like rivers into a fjord. Hedeby, nestled at the southern base of the Jutland Peninsula, was perfectly positioned between the North Sea and the Baltic. A simple glance at a map reveals its genius. Traders could sail up the Schlei Inlet, offload cargo, haul ships a short distance overland, and relaunch on the Baltic side, bypassing the treacherous Skagerrak entirely. By the 9th century, Hedeby's quays echoed with many tongues: Frankish merchants hawking wine and glass, Slavic potters selling patterned wares, Saxon smiths exchanging rivets for walrus ivory, and Arabic envoys purchasing slaves or fine furs to carry back along the Volga trade route. Archaeologists have unearthed scales, balance weights, and silver dirhams from Baghdad, evidence that Viking commerce connected Atlantic tide pools to the markets of the Abbasid Caliphate. Streets of timber plank ran between workshops where leather was tanned, beads were fired in clay furnaces, and rivets were hammered for yet more ships. At night, lantern light flickered across waterfront warehouses, illuminating sacks of rye and heaps of reindeer pelts destined for distant shores. Northeast across the Baltic, on a rocky island in Lake Mälaren, Birka emerged as Sweden's first true town. Though smaller than Hedeby, Birka thrummed with energy. Its wooden quays jutted into frigid water, welcoming boats laden with honey, flax, and iron from the rich ore beds of central Sweden. In return, merchants imported silks from Byzantium, ornate brooches from the Carolingian workshops, and silver coins minted deep in the Islamic world. The town's rampart, a stout earthwork crowned with timber palisades, offered modest protection, but commerce was Birka's real defense. Violence threatened profit, so disputes were settled in market courts, and shipmasters weighed justice against lost trade. Graves outside Birka's walls reveal a cosmopolitan fabric. A woman buried with an Eastern prayer pendant lies beside a warrior whose sword originated in the Rhineland. Nearby, a child rests with Baltic amber beads. These finds suggest not just fleeting visits, but a settled, multi-ethnic community where Norse, Slavic, Finnic, and even Central Asian influences blended into daily life. Farther west, along Norway's rugged southern coast, Kaupang, literally marketplace, blossomed near the mouth of the Oslofjord. Unlike Hedeby's sheltered inlet or Birka's inland lake, Kaupang embraced the open sea, serving as Norway's front door to the North Sea highway. Traders arrived with walrus ivory, soapstone bowls, and falcons prized by Frankish nobility for hunting. Local artisans produced delicate glass beads in swirling hues of cobalt and emerald, objects that later turned up as far away as Russes and the Danelaw. In the surrounding uplands, small farms raised sheep and hardy barley, their surplus feeding town dwellers whose livelihoods relied more on trade than tilling. Seasonal fairs drew caravans from the interior, their pack horses laden with reindeer hides and mountain crystals, transforming Kaupang into a festival of colour, clamour, and opportunity. In these ports, the Viking capacity for adaptation shone as brightly as any sword. A sailor who raided one summer might spend the next spring weighing silver on a portable scale, or swapping stories beside a hearth with a visiting Christian monk curious about life in the frozen north. Contracts were sealed with handshakes and oaths. Hospitality rituals required sharing bread and ale before bargaining could begin. Law speakers recited market codes, ensuring foreign guests received the same protections as local freemen, so long as dues were paid. Such customs laid the groundwork for trust, which in turn fertilized trade's expansion. The image of Vikings must therefore widen. Picture longships not only bristling with shields, but crowded with barrels of salted herring, rolls of homespun wool, and chests of amber beads. Sea settlers guiding livestock ashore at the mouth of the Seine or along the fertile banks of the Dnieper, staking claims that would grow into towns like Dublin and Novgorod. Hear the din of Hedeby's smithies and the call and response of Birka's market criers as vividly as the clash of axes at Lindisfarne. These trading centres did more than enrich Scandinavia. They tethered distant worlds. They carried Arabic mathematics northward, Christian reliquaries eastward, and Norse myths outward, planting stories of Odin and Thor in the imaginations of foreign scribes. Through commerce, the Vikings learned new shipbuilding tricks, adopted foreign coinage, and absorbed ideas of kingship that would later birth unified Nordic realms. Thus, while the chronicles of terrified monks preserved the memory of raids, the docks of Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang whispered another truth, that the Viking Age flowed on currents of exchange as much as conquest, and that beneath each war helm lay a merchant's calculating mind, or a settler's longing for fertile land and peaceful hearth. As the 8th century gave way to the 9th, Viking longships began appearing with increasing frequency along the shores of the British Isles, Ireland, and the northern coast of France. Their dragon-headed prows became symbols of dread, carving into estuaries and up rivers with alarming speed. What had begun with the shocking assault on Lindisfarne in 793 evolved into a sustained campaign of seasonal raids, calculated not only for plunder but for strategic control. These were not mindless assaults. They were carefully timed operations, targeting rich monasteries, undefended towns, and trade arteries at moments of maximum vulnerability. In time, what began as sudden raids would give way to permanent footholds, some of which would become full-fledged Viking cities. The British Isles proved especially vulnerable in this period. Political fragmentation across Anglo-Saxon England meant that few kingdoms could mount effective coastal defence. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia were often locked in internal disputes or distracted by rivalries, and few had standing navies. The Vikings, in contrast, were not burdened by static borders. Their ships gave them unmatched mobility, able to strike, vanish, and return again before reinforcements could arrive. Monasteries such as Jarrow, Iona, and Glendalough, famed for their wealth and learning, were looted repeatedly. These were places filled not with soldiers, but with scribes and monks, and their libraries, centuries of religious texts, were often destroyed or scattered in the chaos. In Ireland, the raids took on an even more ambitious tone. The Emerald Isle, rich in monastic gold and ecclesiastical treasures, became a prime target. By the early 800s, Norse raiders were no longer merely hitting and fleeing, they were staying. Viking bases or long forts began appearing along river estuaries, serving as temporary camps that gradually became permanent settlements. One of the most significant was a long fort established on the banks of the river Liffey in 841 CE. This site would evolve into Dublin, a name derived from Dubh Linn or Black Pool, referring to the dark tidal basin where the Norse ships once moored. Dublin soon grew into one of the most important Viking cities in the Western world. What began as a seasonal raiding post developed into a bustling centre of trade and governance. Ships came and went laden with slaves, amber, silk, and silver. The Norse introduced new urban planning techniques and market systems, while also integrating with local Irish populations through both warfare and intermarriage. Dublin became a melting pot, where Norse language mixed with Gaelic, and where Scandinavian craftsmanship left its mark on weaponry, jewellery, and shipbuilding alike. The city's streets echoed not only with the clang of the blacksmith, but with the cries of merchants and the chants of Christian priests negotiating for the return of captives. Elsewhere along the coasts of Ireland and Scotland, similar settlements began to appear. Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, and Cork all had Norse origins. These were not merely ports, they were fortified hubs of regional power. Defensive earthen ramparts, wooden palisades, and protected harbours made them hard targets, allowing Norse control to persist long after the initial shock of raiding had faded. From these bases, Viking fleets could launch expeditions deep into the Irish interior or across the Irish Sea to strike at Wales, Cornwall, or even southern England. Across the Channel, the coasts of northern France, particularly the region of Neustria, later known as Normandy, also felt the wrath of Viking ambition. The River Seine provided an open highway deep into Frankish territory, allowing Norse fleets to bypass coastal defences and strike at the heart of Charlemagne's empire. Paris itself was famously besieged in 845 by a fleet led by the legendary chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok, or so the sagas claim. While the historical accuracy of Ragnar's involvement remains debated, what is certain is that the Viking presence along the Seine was both persistent and costly. The Frankish kings, unable to repel the invaders outright, were often forced to pay danegeld, tribute in silver, in hopes of buying peace. But peace was rarely permanent. Viking groups returned again and again, testing the resolve of the Franks and mapping the weaknesses of every riverbank fortress. Eventually, rather than simply endure these raids, local leaders began to negotiate terms of settlement. The seeds of what would later become the Duchy of Normandy were planted in these moments, where military failure turned into political accommodation, and Norsemen became landholders rather than raiders. Coastal fortresses, both built by the Vikings and adapted from existing structures, became crucial to this new phase of expansion. These strongholds, often located at river mouths or natural harbours, allowed for storage of goods, repair of ships, and defence against counterattacks. Some were ring forts with earthen walls, others grew into wooden fortresses with docks, watchtowers, and markets. They were symbols of permanence, declaring that the Norse were not merely passing through, they had come to stay. Through this evolution from raiders to settlers, the Vikings redefined their relationship with the world. The same ships that once delivered terror now carried timber, livestock, and families. Villages once sacked became towns co-governed. And across the British Isles, Ireland, and northern France, the Norse legacy was no longer etched only in blood, but in stone, lore, language, and lineage. The spiritual universe of the Vikings was as vast and mysterious as the icy seas they sailed. It was not built from holy books or centralized churches, but from living stories passed mouth to mouth across generations. These stories, part theology, part moral compass, and part entertainment, form the core of Norse belief. In them, gods walked among men, giants threatened to undo the world, and fate wove a web even the mightiest could not escape. Central to this rich cosmology were the gods of the Norse pantheon, figures like Odin, Thor, Freya, and Loki, each representing different aspects of life, death, nature, and war. Odin, the All-Father, was the chief of the gods. Far from a benevolent creator, Odin was a complex, sometimes fearsome deity. He sought knowledge above all else, even sacrificing one of his eyes for wisdom at Mimir's well. He was the god of war, poetry, magic, and death. He rode an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, was accompanied by 2 ravens, Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, and was said to have hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain the secret of runes. His association with both battle and prophecy made him a favorite of warriors and seers alike. Thor, the Thunderer, was Odin's son and the defender of gods and humans alike. With his mighty hammer Mjolnir, Thor guarded Asgard, the realm of the gods, from giants and other threats. His booming presence was less enigmatic than Odin's. He was direct, physical, and beloved by common folk. Farmers, sailors, and warriors alike called upon Thor for strength and protection. When thunderstorms rolled over Scandinavian mountains, it was said that Thor was riding his chariot across the sky, hammer in hand. Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and battle, offered a more sensual and mysterious dimension to the pantheon. She was known for her beauty, her chariot pulled by cats, and her command of Seder, a type of Norse magic dealing with fate and destiny. Half of all warriors slain in battle were said to go not to Valhalla, but to Freya's own hall, Folkvanga. Her twin brother Freya was a god of peace, prosperity, and good harvests, and the two were originally part of the Vanir, a group of nature-oriented gods. The Aesir-Vanir divide reflects a key tension in the Norse mythos. The Aesir, led by Odin, represented order, war, and sovereignty. The Vanir, associated with Freya and Freyja, symbolized fertility, nature, and harmony. According to the myths, the two groups of gods once fought a war, but eventually made peace, exchanging hostages and sharing knowledge. This mythic reconciliation may reflect an older religious fusion, possibly mirroring the historical merging of different tribal belief systems across Scandinavia. Then there was Loki, the trickster. Neither fully god nor giant, Loki was a shapeshifter and mischief maker, whose cleverness could both save and doom the gods. He fathered monstrous children, including the wolf Fenrir, the serpent Jörmungandr, and Hel, the queen of the underworld. Loki's role in Norse myth is deeply ambivalent. He is both helper and destroyer, a companion to Thor in some tales, and the bringer of doom in others. It is Loki who, at the end of all things, will lead the forces of chaos against the gods in the final battle. This leads us to the cosmology of the Norse world, a deeply layered vision of existence anchored by the great Yggdrasil, the world tree. Yggdrasil's roots and branches connected 9 realms of existence: Asgard, home of the Aesir; Midgard, realm of humans; Vanaheim, realm of the Vanir; Jotunheim, land of the giants; Niflheim, world of ice; Muspelheim, world of fire; Alfheim, land of light elves; Svartalfheim, land of dwarves; and Helheim, the realm of the dead. These realms were interconnected, influencing one another through gods, magic, and fate. At the heart of Viking belief was the idea of Valhalla, the warrior's afterlife. Those who died bravely in battle were said to be chosen by Odin's Valkyries, celestial shield maidens, to reside in his hall. There, they would feast, drink, and fight by day, preparing for the great battle of Ragnarok, the end of the world. This final cataclysm was not a vision of eternal damnation, but a cyclical rebirth. At Ragnarok, the gods and their enemies would clash. Odin would fall to Fenrir. Thor would slay the world serpent, but die of its venom, and the world itself would burn and sink beneath the sea. And then, from the ashes, a new world would rise. Such a vision infused Viking life with a paradoxical mix of fatalism and courage. Death was inevitable, but a glorious death could secure eternal honor. Life was harsh, but meaning could be found in loyalty, bravery, and the bonds of kinship and gods. The myths were not merely stories. They were a framework through which the Norse explained the storms, the seasons, and the soul. They carried these tales across oceans, carving them into stones, whispering them beside hearths, and invoking them in times of danger and decision. In this vast and intricate belief system, one finds a mirror of the Viking spirit. Bold, fatalistic, poetic, and unafraid to face the unknown. The gods were not perfect. They were fierce, flawed, and doomed. But in their struggle, the Norse saw their own, a world of honor in the face of chaos, and beauty even in the certainty of endings. While the Norse pantheon provided the narrative foundation of Viking spirituality, the lived religion of early Scandinavians was far more rooted in the physical world: blood, stone, earth, and breath. The Vikings did not construct towering temples like those in Rome or Byzantium. Instead, their worship unfolded in sacred groves, beside stones carved with runes, and in the rhythm of seasonal rituals that linked daily life with the myths they cherished. The gods were not distant deities, but neighbors, watchful, temperamental, and deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. Sacrifices, known as blot, formed the spiritual core of Norse religious practice. These were not merely acts of appeasement, but moments of communion, rites of gratitude, petition, and cosmic renewal. Offerings ranged from mead and bread to the blood of animals like pigs, cattle, and horses. In exceptional cases, even humans were sacrificed, particularly during times of famine, war, or succession crises. These ceremonies often took place outdoors in sacred groves, lunda, or near burial mounds believed to be gateways to the spirit world. The act of sacrifice was both communal and sacred, accompanied by feasting, chants, and invocations to the gods. Blood from the sacrificed animal was often sprinkled on statues of the gods, the temple walls, and the gathered participants using a sacred twig brush called a hlautein. It was a moment of intense symbolism, the life force of one being offered in exchange for divine favor, abundance, or victory. In tandem with these rituals were the runestones, carved memorials that served both as public declarations and spiritual testaments. These stones, tall slabs etched with angular runes, dotted the Scandinavian landscape, often placed along roads, near burial sites, or outside homesteads. Some were commemorative, inscribed in memory of the dead by surviving family members. Others celebrated conquests, alliances, or land ownership. Yet many bore spiritual significance as well, invoking protection from the gods or referencing mythic events. The runic alphabet itself, known as the Futhark, was believed to carry magical power. To carve runes was not simply to write. It was to cast a spell, to shape destiny through the careful scoring of stone or wood. Odin himself, according to myth, discovered the runes during his self-sacrifice on the world tree Yggdrasil, making each rune a shard of divine insight. Sacred groves held a different kind of power, spaces where nature and the divine were believed to overlap. These forested sanctuaries, often left untouched by axes or plows, were home to tree spirits, ancestral ghosts, and the watchful eyes of the gods. Some groves were associated with specific deities or local spirits known as landvettir, guardian beings who protected farms, fjords, and villages. Offerings were left at the base of trees, especially ancient oaks and ash, whose roots were thought to echo the great Yggdrasil itself. The natural stillness of these groves, broken only by the rustling of leaves or the whisper of the wind, was not merely atmospheric, it was sacred. Here decisions were made, prayers were spoken, and secrets passed into the soil. Presiding over many of these rites and interpretations were women known as seeresses, or volur, plural of vulva. These women held a unique and powerful role in Viking society, part prophetess, part healer, part priestess. The vulva was often an older woman, highly respected, feared, and rarely married. She traveled from village to village, wrapped in furs adorned with charms and staffs, believed to channel spiritual energy. Her primary gift was the practice of Sidra, a form of ritual magic and prophecy said to influence fate, summon visions, and bind or release hidden forces. During ceremonies, the vulva would sit on a raised platform or in a ritual circle, sometimes assisted by singers chanting Vardlokur, songs that called spirits to attend. Under trance, she would speak in riddles or images, interpreting signs from the gods, foretelling battles or offering advice on planting seasons and marriages. What made her unique in Norse culture was her ability to navigate the blurred line between the mythic and the real. She was not merely a conduit to the gods. She was a bridge between the world of humans and the deeper rhythms of the cosmos. Even in everyday life, myth and reality blended seamlessly for the Vikings. Stories of gods were not confined to storytelling. They infused the seasons, inspired the naming of weekdays, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, and shaped how people interpreted dreams, illness, and weather. A poor harvest might be seen as Freya's displeasure, a lightning storm, a sign of Thor's protection, or his wrath. The Norse did not separate the sacred from the mundane. When a sailor whispered to Njord before launching into stormy seas, or when a farmer placed a stone carved with runes at the edge of his field, it was not superstition, it was survival, grounded in generations of belief. This closeness between myth and life gave the Viking worldview its unique texture. Their rituals did not seek forgiveness or eternal salvation. They aimed for harmony with unseen forces, for alignment with destiny. In death, just as in life, the line between mortal and mythic remained thin. The funeral pyre was both an ending and a passage, to Valhalla, to Helheim, or perhaps simply to the wind-swept unknown. Through sacrifices, sacred spaces, and seers, the Vikings cultivated a spiritual life that was tactile, immediate, and deeply interwoven with nature and story. It was a world where gods did not watch from afar. They walked beside you, in the rustle of the grove, the shape of the storm, and the whisper of the rune. In the spring of 845 CE, a chilling silence fell over the city of Paris. The River Seine, once a lifeline of commerce and communication, now bore an ominous procession of dragon-headed ships. 70 longships, led by the legendary Viking chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok, whose name may be more saga than certainty, cut through the water with grim intent. The Frankish world, a patchwork of Christian kingdoms under the fading authority of Charlemagne's heirs, was about to feel the full force of Norse ambition. The siege of Paris in 845 CE marked a turning point. The city, though fortified, was not prepared for a coordinated naval siege. Ragnar's fleet moved swiftly, attacking Rouen first, and then advancing toward the capital. The Franks, under King Charles the Bald, tried to muster a defense, but their forces were fragmented and poorly coordinated. In a dramatic move, Ragnar captured 111 Frankish soldiers and, according to sources, hanged them on an island in the Seine as a warning. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. As fear gripped the city, Charles made a decision that would echo through European politics for decades. He paid the invaders to leave. The sum was staggering for the time: 7,000 livres, or pounds, of silver, a payment known as Danegeld, or Danish gold. It was not the first time a European ruler would buy off Viking raiders, nor would it be the last. This act of ransom wasn't seen as cowardice, it was survival. But with it came a dangerous precedent. The Vikings learned that with enough pressure, entire cities would pay for peace. Silver flowed into Norse hands, and with it came more ships, more warriors, and more reason to return. Indeed, Francia, divided and vulnerable, became a favorite target for Norse raids. Viking fleets penetrated far inland via the Seine, Loire, and Garonne rivers, striking towns and monasteries well beyond the coastal defences. Tours, Bordeaux, Nantes, and even Toulouse saw Norse swords. The Carolingian kings, unable to maintain unity or muster consistent military resistance, often resorted to further payments. The Franks attempted to fortify cities with stone walls and river chains, but these defences were reactive and slow to implement. The Longships, sleek and shallow-bottomed, simply sailed around them or struck where defences were weakest. But the Norse were not content with silver alone. Over time, raiding evolved into settlement, particularly in the northern region of Francia, later known as Normandy. By the early 10th century, the Frankish leadership recognized the futility of endless skirmishes. In a pragmatic turn, King Charles the Simple made a deal with a Viking chieftain named Rollo, an agreement that would permanently alter the political landscape of Western Europe. In 911 CE, the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte was signed. Rollo was granted land along the lower Seine in exchange for fealty to the Frankish crown, Christian conversion, and protection of the region from further Viking incursions. This territory would become Normandy, or Land of the Northmen. It was a brilliant move. The Vikings, once raiders, became rulers, part of the very world they had once terrorized. They adopted Frankish language, Christian customs, and feudal governance while retaining many Norse traditions, particularly in law and military organization. Under Rollo and his descendants, Normandy flourished. The Norse legacy there was architectural, as well as cultural. Fortified towns, stone churches, and early castles rose where thatched villages once stood. Norse and Frankish bloodlines intermingled, and the duchy became a powerhouse in Western Europe. It was from Normandy, of course, that Rollo's descendant, William the Conqueror, would launch his invasion of England in 1066, an event rooted in Viking ambition, but shaped by Frankish politics. The broader implication of these events was the transformation of Viking identity. They were no longer simply outsiders attacking Christian Europe. They were becoming part of it. In Francia, the sword had given way to the oath. The Danegeld had brought temporary peace, but the settlements that followed brought lasting change. The Viking raids had begun as violent incursions, but they ended in integration, reshaping the map and culture of medieval Europe in profound ways. And yet, while Francia found its uneasy peace through negotiation and settlement, the British Isles would face a much longer and bloodier entanglement with the Norse invaders. The Danes and Norwegians would return to those shores again and again, not just with axes and fire, but with ambitions of kingship and conquest. But that story, still unfolding across the waters, would carry its own legacy of kingdoms forged in battle and lands carved by the Longships' prow. In the year 865 CE, a force unlike any seen before landed on the shores of East Anglia. It was not a swift raiding party, nor a handful of opportunistic longships. It was a massive, coordinated military campaign. Known in later chronicles as the Great Heathen Army, this force marked a dramatic escalation in Viking activity in the British Isles. No longer content with hit-and-run raids, the Norsemen now arrived with the intent to conquer, settle and transform the political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. The Great Heathen Army, or Michael here as it was called in Old English, was likely composed of thousands of warriors drawn from Denmark and possibly Norway. Its leadership included several famed Norse figures, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ubba, often portrayed in saga literature as the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok. Whether these connections are myth or fact remains debated, but what is certain is that these leaders commanded a formidable force with strategic vision and staying power. Their campaign began in East Anglia, where the local king, Edmund, offered tribute and horses rather than resistance, a decision that would delay the conflict but not prevent it. From there, the Vikings moved north and captured the ancient city of York in 866, establishing a stronghold in the heart of Northumbria. The fall of York, a centre of Christianity and Anglo-Saxon learning, was a symbolic blow. Two rival Northumbrian kings, Ella and Osbert, attempted to retake the city but were defeated, with Ella famously meeting a gruesome end that later legends romanticized as the Blood Eagle execution. Having secured York, the Great Heathen Army swept south. Mercia, long one of the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, managed to delay total conquest through negotiation and tribute, but the Vikings pressed onward. East Anglia, once a reluctant host, became a battlefield. In 869, King Edmund was captured, and according to Christian hagiographies, martyred for refusing to renounce his faith, bound to a tree and shot full of arrows. His death would make him a saint and symbol of resistance, but it did little to slow the Norse advance. The real turning point came with the invasion of Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, in the early 870s. Here the Vikings met their most formidable resistance in the figure of Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great. Though Alfred would eventually halt the Norse advance and secure a treaty, the earlier years of the campaign were devastating. Fortresses were overrun, and entire regions were brought under Viking control. What emerged from this prolonged conflict was not just a battlefield stalemate, but a new political reality: the formation of the Danelaw. This was not a single kingdom, but a swath of territory in central and northern England, governed by Viking laws, customs, and leadership. The Danelaw extended roughly from the River Thames to the Humber and from East Anglia to the edge of Mercia. Within this zone, Norse legal practices held sway. Land was parcelled differently, inheritance followed Norse custom, and place names began to reflect Scandinavian roots. Towns like Derby, York, Jorvik, and Lincoln grew under Norse influence, becoming centres of trade and governance. The creation of the Danelaw marked a fundamental shift in the Viking presence in England. The Norse were no longer foreign invaders. They were rulers, settlers, and lawgivers. Intermarriage between Norsemen and Anglo-Saxon women blurred ethnic lines. Bilingualism became common, and the Norse religion, though eventually supplanted by Christianity, left its trace in local folklore and tradition. Yet the Danelaw was not a static or peaceful domain. It existed in tension with the southern English kingdoms, particularly Wessex, which under Alfred and his descendants sought to reclaim and unify the land. Treaties were signed and broken. Borders shifted with each campaign. But even as conflict continued, the integration of Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures deepened. Norse art and craftsmanship began to influence English styles. Legal terms and administrative units, such as the wapentake, a Norse form of district, entered English usage. Ultimately, the Danelaw would be absorbed into a unified English kingdom in the early 10th century, particularly under King Edward the Elder and Athelstan, Alfred's successors, but its legacy endured. It left behind a hybrid culture, a mix of warrior values, pragmatic governance, and rich traditions that helped shape the character of medieval England. The story of the great heathen army is thus not merely one of conquest, but of transformation. Through blood and diplomacy, through war and settlement, the Vikings carved out a space in the heart of England, one that would persist in law, language, and identity long after the last longship vanished from its shores. In the face of unrelenting Viking aggression, when much of Anglo-Saxon England lay subdued or in tribute, one kingdom stood defiantly on the edge of collapse, Wessex. And at its helm rose a man who would not only defend his homeland, but reimagine what kingship could be. Alfred the Great, born in 849 and crowned king in 871, was neither a warrior of overwhelming might nor a monarch of unshakable power. He was instead a thinker, a reformer, and a strategist who recognized that beating the Norse required more than the sword. It demanded transformation. Alfred's early reign was marked by near catastrophe. Viking incursions had reduced the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to ruin, and the great heathen army had moved deep into southern England. In 878, Alfred suffered a major setback at Chippenham, where a surprise Viking attack forced him into retreat. For a time, he disappeared into the marshlands of Athelney, a fugitive king with only a handful of loyal supporters. It was there, in the muddy solitude of the Somerset levels, that legend claims he burned cakes while lost in thought, a quiet symbol of humility and perseverance. But from this low point came resurgence. Alfred regrouped, gathered his forces, and struck decisively at the Battle of Edington in the spring of 878. Facing the formidable Viking warlord Guthrum, Alfred secured a decisive victory, forcing the Danes to retreat and ultimately to negotiate. What followed was a pivotal moment, not just in military terms, but in the evolution of Viking-Christian relations. The Treaty of Wedmore, likely formalized later in 886, marked the beginning of a unique coexistence. Guthrum agreed to withdraw his forces beyond the boundaries of Wessex and to accept Christian baptism, with Alfred himself serving as sponsor. This baptism was not merely a symbolic gesture, it was a political tool. By embracing Christianity, Guthrum signaled a willingness to engage with Anglo-Saxon norms and institutions, and by sponsoring him, Alfred extended legitimacy to the truce. This truce would eventually lead to a clearer territorial division between Anglo-Saxon Wessex and the Viking-held Danelaw. While the north and east of England remained under Norse influence, Wessex and its southern allies began to consolidate. Alfred took full advantage of the breathing space this peace allowed. He reorganized his kingdom from the ground up. First came military reform. Alfred introduced a system of burhs, fortified towns designed to resist sudden raids. These strongholds were connected by roads and rivers, creating a network of defense and commerce. Every free man had a duty in this new system, either to serve in the rotating fyrd militia, or to support the kingdom's fortresses with supplies and labor. This gave Wessex a standing readiness that no other Anglo-Saxon realm had previously achieved. Alfred also invested in naval construction, commissioning ships that were longer, faster, and deeper than traditional Norse longships. Built to patrol the southern coasts and intercept Viking raiders before they landed, these vessels reflected Alfred's commitment to learning from the enemy's strengths and countering them with innovation. Equally transformative were Alfred's legal and educational reforms. He believed that ignorance was a root cause of decline. To remedy this, he championed literacy and learning in Old English, not just Latin, so that clergy and noblemen alike could access law, scripture, and wisdom. He personally oversaw the translation of key texts, including Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care. These were not just scholarly efforts, they were moral blueprints for rulership, ethics, and civic responsibility. Through these reforms, Alfred laid the groundwork for a revived English identity, one capable of withstanding and even absorbing the Viking presence. The Christian faith, once imperiled by Norse paganism, now offered a common ground. Churches were rebuilt, laws were codified with biblical undertones, and Viking leaders like Guthrum, while remaining politically independent, operated in a space increasingly influenced by Anglo-Saxon norms. This period of Viking-Christian coexistence was neither entirely peaceful nor entirely hostile. It was a time of cultural negotiation, of trade and tension, of religious compromise and political calculation. Marriages between Norse settlers and local Anglo-Saxon families became more common. Names, customs, and languages blended. In some regions, Viking and English law coexisted uneasily but functionally, with legal assemblies, things, reflecting both traditions. Alfred the Great did not live to see the full unification of England, but he reshaped its future. By resisting not only with arms but with reforms, education and diplomacy, he ensured that Wessex would become the nucleus of a future kingdom. His model of kingship, practical, learned and grounded in moral purpose, would endure far beyond his reign. And on the other side of the Channel, in a region known as Normandy, another Viking leader would soon follow a similar path. Like Alfred, he too would find a way to bridge the worlds of Norse and Christian, raider and ruler. But that story belonged to Rollo, and it was just beginning. In the early 10th century, as Viking sails still haunted the rivers of Western Europe and Norse, ambition spread far from Scandinavia. A new chapter of integration unfolded across the Channel. At the heart of this transformation stood Rollo, a Norse chieftain whose ferocity as a raider would eventually give way to the role of a Christian duke and a founder of one of the most influential regions in medieval Europe, Normandy. Rollo, also known in Norse as Hrolfr, was likely of Danish or Norwegian origin, and his reputation as a formidable leader preceded him. According to later chroniclers, including Dudo of Saint-Quentin, Rollo had led or joined multiple raids along the coasts of Francia during the late 9th and early 10th centuries. His forces were well trained in riverine warfare, sailing up the Seine and Loire with alarming speed, striking monasteries and towns, and retreating before organized resistance could materialize. But Rollo was not merely a plunderer, he was a strategist. By 911 CE, after years of back-and-forth raiding and occupation, he had set his sights not only on silver, but on settlement. The region of Neustria, along the lower Seine, had been ravaged by Viking incursions for decades. Its inhabitants were weary, its defences scattered. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, recognized that military efforts alone could not secure lasting peace. And so negotiations began. The resulting pact, known as the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, marked a watershed moment in Viking European relations. Rollo would receive a tract of land centered around Rouen, land that would become Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In exchange, he pledged fealty to the Frankish crown, agreed to defend the kingdom against future Viking raids, and, crucially, to convert to Christianity. In a symbolic and diplomatic gesture, Rollo underwent baptism, taking the Christian name Robert, and likely marrying a Frankish noblewoman to seal the alliance. This was no hollow oath. Rollo and his followers settled in the region not as occupying marauders, but as landholders and administrators. The Norsemen who had once burned churches now helped build them. They adopted the feudal system, swore loyalty to their Frankish overlords, and began the slow process of cultural assimilation. Over time, Rollo's descendants would become some of the most powerful magnates in Europe. But the transformation of Normandy was not a one-sided absorption. It was a blending, a fusion of Norse vigor and Frankish tradition. The newcomers brought with them their own language, legal customs, and warrior ethos. Norse names were inscribed alongside Latin and Old French. While many Norse settlers eventually spoke the local dialect, elements of Old Norse vocabulary remained, particularly in place names, personal names, and maritime terminology. The architecture of Normandy began to shift as well. Wooden Viking halls gave way to stone churches and castles, built with Frankish techniques but often organized around Norse communal traditions. Fortified towns and monastic centers like Rouen, Bayeux, and Fécamp became regional hubs of culture and governance. These cities, once vulnerable outposts on the Frankish frontier, evolved into bastions of law, trade, and Christianity, thanks in part to Norse settlers who had now invested themselves in the land. Linguistically, this era produced a creolization of culture. The Old Norse tongue gradually faded, but not before it left its imprint on the emerging Norman dialect, a variant of Old French that carried a distinctive northern flavor. Norse terms related to seafaring, weaponry, and legal affairs found their way into everyday speech. Even Norman French personal names like Gilbert, Roger, and Robert often traced back to Norse originals such as Giselbert, Hrodgar, and Hrolfr. Socially, intermarriage between Norse settlers and Frankish. Locals blurred ethnic lines. Children of these unions inherited a dual legacy. The martial traditions and exploratory instincts of the Norse and the administrative sophistication and ecclesiastical structures of the Franks. This combination gave rise to a uniquely Norman identity, neither wholly Viking nor fully Frankish, but something new. This hybrid culture would prove not only durable, but influential. The Normans, descended from Rollo's followers, became renowned across Europe for their military prowess, organizational skill, and cultural adaptability. Within a century, they would cross the Channel to conquer England in 1066, under William the Conqueror, Rollo's descendant. They would also spread into southern Italy, Sicily, and even the Levant during the Crusades. Yet the roots of all this lay in a moment of compromise, when a Norse warlord bent the knee not in surrender, but in strategy. The story of Rollo and the creation of Normandy is a story of adaptation over annihilation, of integration over eradication. In embracing land, law, and religion, the Vikings in Normandy became more than settlers. They became a bridge between the old pagan north and the Christianized heart of medieval Europe. And from this bridge, new kingdoms and new legacies would rise. While the Western Viking exploits in England and Francia are well known, another equally significant saga unfolded to the east, along the broad rivers, dark forests, and ancient trade routes of Eastern Europe. Here, the Vikings were known not as raiders, but as Varangians, a term likely derived from the Old Norse Varangi, meaning a sworn companion or trusted ally. This title reflected not only their martial strength, but their vital role in a web of commerce and political transformation that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the glittering walls of Constantinople. The rivers of Eastern Europe were the key to this expansion. Unlike the stormy North Atlantic, these were inland highways, natural corridors that led southward through vast territories inhabited by Slavic, Finnic, and Turkic peoples. The most important of these were the Volga and the Dnieper, which flowed through dense wilderness and connected the Viking homelands to the Caspian and Black Seas. It was along these rivers that the Norse established what became known as the Varangian route, a transcontinental path of trade, diplomacy, and settlement. Setting out from base ports like Ladoga and Staraya Ladoga, Viking traders, often traveling in small, maneuverable boats known as monoxylons or larger longships, navigated the treacherous rapids and winding tributaries with both courage and calculation. They portaged their boats across land when needed, dragging them over logs or hiring local labor. This was not a realm of conquest by brute force. Rather, it was a negotiation with geography and with the mosaic of cultures they encountered. By the mid-9th century, the Norse presence had crystallized into something more permanent. They did not merely pass through the Slavic lands, they settled, intermarried, and eventually founded city-states that would evolve into some of Eastern Europe's most important medieval centers. Chief among these were Novgorod and Kiev. Novgorod, meaning new town in Slavic, is often cited as one of the earliest and most significant Viking-founded settlements in the region. Located on the Volkhov River, it served as a strategic midpoint between the Baltic Sea and the vast inland routes. By the 860s, Norse chieftains had begun to rule over this multi-ethnic community, blending their own customs with those of the local Slavic population. While exact details are murky, archaeological finds such as Norse-style weapons, burial mounds, and Scandinavian runic inscriptions attest to their deep presence. The political organization of these settlements took a distinctive turn. The Norse, accustomed to clan-based leadership and regional chieftains, adopted and adapted to Slavic models of tribal assembly. In time, the Vech, a public council, became a hallmark of cities like Novgorod, indicating early forms of civic deliberation that blended Viking independence with Slavic communal traditions. Further south, along the Dnieper, lay Kiev, a city destined to become the crown jewel of Viking ambitions in the east. Its location was ideal, a midpoint between the Baltic and the Black Sea, where traders could connect with both Slavic hinterlands and Byzantine markets. Viking rule in Kiev is traditionally attributed to the chieftain Oleg, who, according to Bym, the primary chronicle, seized the city in the late 9th century and declared it the mother of Rus cities. Under Oleg and his successors, including Igor, Olga, and Sviatoslav, Kiev flourished into a powerful and cosmopolitan center. The term Kievan Rus came to define both the realm and its ruling elite, a fusion of Norse governance and Slavic cultural identity. While the exact ethnic composition of the Rus' ruling class remains debated, the Norse influence is clear in early dynastic names, burial practices, and military organization. However, over the generations, the Scandinavian origins of these rulers faded into a broader Slavic context. The Norse language gave way to Old East Slavic, and Viking identity transformed into that of the emerging Rus' people. Yet, despite this integration, the commercial ambitions of the Vikings remained central. From Novgorod and Kiev, they exported furs, wax, honey, and slaves, highly valued commodities in the markets of Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate. In return, they imported silver, silks, glassware, and spices, elevating the material culture of the Rus' cities and linking them into the vast economic networks of the medieval world. The eastern journey of the Vikings thus tells a tale not of conquest alone, but of navigation, negotiation, and nation-building. It was a path carved not just with swords, but with trade goods and treaties. From the pine-forested shores of Lake Ladoga to the golden domes of Kiev, the Varangians helped shape the political and cultural map of Eastern Europe. And their influence would soon reach even further, southward to the gates of Constantinople, where their story would take yet another remarkable turn. As Norse adventurers carved river routes deep into Eastern Europe, their ambitions began to shift from transient trade to political permanence. The men who had once arrived as merchants and raiders increasingly became rulers, administrators, and founders of dynasties. Among them, one name stands out as a cornerstone of Eastern Slavic history: Rurik. Though historical certainty is elusive, Rurik is traditionally credited, especially by the primary chronicle, a key 12th century Kievan text, with establishing the first ruling dynasty in the region that would become Kievan Rus. A chieftain from the Scandinavian lands, likely from what is now Sweden, Rurik was, according to legend, invited by the Slavic and Finnic tribes to govern over them and bring order to their fractious lands. This invitation was said to follow internal conflicts and lawlessness, as local leaders sought an external arbiter with both martial strength and political neutrality. Whether or not the account is entirely factual, it captures an essential truth of the Viking experience in the East, that Norse leaders, through a mixture of charisma, force, and opportunity, inserted themselves into the heart of emerging Slavic power structures. Rurik is believed to have established his rule in Novgorod around 862 CE. From there, his lineage expanded its influence southward along the Dnieper River, culminating in the control of Kiev. His descendants, including Oleg, Igor, Olga, and Sviatoslav, would oversee a flourishing kingdom that blended Norse and Slavic traditions in governance, religion, and military affairs. The Rurikid dynasty would continue for centuries, ruling Kievan Rus, the principalities of later medieval Russia, and even extending its influence into the early Tsardom of Muscovy. This dynastic continuity ensured that the Norse imprint on Slavic history was not fleeting. It became foundational. But the ambitions of the Norse in the East extended beyond local power. They sought not only land and titles, but also access to the wealth of the wider world, particularly the riches of the Byzantine Empire. The journey southward, down the Dnieper River, led to the magnificent city of Constantinople, or as the Norse called it, Miklagard, the Great City. It was here that Viking ambitions met the marvels of Byzantine sophistication. The Byzantines, for their part, were wary of these tall, fair-haired northerners who arrived in sleek longships. Early encounters were fraught with tension. Viking raids on Constantinople occurred in the 860s and 900s, some of which reached the city's formidable sea walls. Yet over time, conflict gave way to commerce and cooperation. Treaties were signed and trade routes formalized. Viking traders brought furs, slaves, honey, and amber, while Byzantine merchants offered silks, wine, coins, and ecclesiastical objects. The Byzantines, astonished by the martial prowess and towering presence of these foreigners, found a new use for them, not as enemies, but as protectors. This gave rise to one of the most fascinating institutions of Viking history, the Varangian Guard. Beginning in the late 10th century, Norse warriors were recruited into the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. The guard was not composed of ordinary soldiers. These were hand-picked warriors known for their loyalty, fearlessness, and discipline. In a court riddled with intrigue and political plots, the Varangians, bound by oath to serve the emperor alone, provided a crucial counterbalance to native factions. The service of Norsemen in the Varangian Guard elevated their reputation across Europe. Armed with massive axes and clad in mail, they were both a deterrent and a symbol of imperial prestige. Some of the most famous Norsemen, including later Anglo-Saxon exiles like Harald Hardrada, would serve in the Guard, amassing wealth and experience before returning home. Harald himself, before claiming the Norwegian throne, spent years in Byzantine service, fighting in Sicily, Anatolia, and possibly even the Holy Land. His tales of distant battlefields and glittering palaces would later be woven into the rich tapestry of Norse sagas. Beyond their military role, the Varangians also served as cultural intermediaries. They returned to the north not only with gold and Byzantine artifacts, but with stories, architectural knowledge, and exposure to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. In this way, they helped bridge the pagan world of the north with the Christian empires of the south, laying the groundwork for the eventual Christianization of Kievan Rus' under Vladimir the Great in 988 CE. The Norse presence in Byzantium and the Slavic lands illustrates a core truth about the Viking Age. It was not merely an era of pillaging and conquest, but also of integration, diplomacy, and transcontinental exchange. From Rurik's principality to the Varangian Guard, the eastern journey of the Vikings reshaped the destiny of nations and empires, linking the icy lakes of Scandinavia to the golden domes of Constantinople. The vast northern ocean, cold and unpredictable, was not a barrier for the Norse, it was a highway. As Viking sails receded from the rivers of Francia and Slavic lands, they turned westward across the open sea. There, far from the crowded settlements of Scandinavia and the worn trade routes of Europe, lay new frontiers, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually Vinland, a land shrouded in legend. These journeys were not mere raids, but bold acts of exploration, driven by the enduring Viking spirit of curiosity, endurance, and the search for opportunity. The story begins with Iceland, a remote and uninhabited island sitting alone in the North Atlantic. Around 870 CE, Norse settlers began to arrive, first in scattered groups and later in waves, fleeing political tensions, overpopulation, or the centralizing power of kings in Norway. These pioneers were not conquerors, but colonists, bringing with them livestock, tools, and family traditions. Among the early settlers was Ingolfur Arnason, who is often credited in Icelandic lore as the first permanent settler. According to legend, he threw his high-seat pillars into the sea and vowed to build his home wherever they landed. They washed ashore near what is now Reykjavik, the capital of modern Iceland. Unlike many other Viking-settled lands, Iceland developed with minimal native resistance. There was no indigenous population to displace. Instead, the settlers had to contend with a harsh but majestic landscape. Glaciers, volcanoes, lava fields, and icy fjords. These natural challenges required cooperation, not domination. And so, from the beginning, Icelandic society leaned heavily on shared norms and consensus building rather than centralized authority. This ethos culminated in the creation of the Althing in 930 CE, one of the world's earliest known parliaments. Meeting annually at Thingvellir, a broad, rocky plain in the island's southwest, chieftains and free men gathered to resolve disputes, pass laws, and conduct legal proceedings. The Althing did not elect a king or enforce its decisions through standing armies. Instead, it relied on communal memory, legal tradition, and social pressure, forming what historians call a proto-democratic assembly rooted in oral law and mutual accountability. Its creation was a remarkable departure from the feudal hierarchies growing elsewhere in Europe and a testament to the egalitarian streak within Norse culture. As Iceland stabilized, the Viking gaze shifted again, this time further west. Around the year 982, a man named Eric the Red found himself exiled from Iceland for committing manslaughter. In true Norse fashion, exile did not end his story. It began a new one. Sailing westward into the unknown, Eric reached a massive, icy island that had previously been sighted by other Norse seafarers. He spent several years exploring its coasts and fjords before returning to Iceland to recruit settlers. Cleverly, he named the island Greenland, hoping the pleasant-sounding name would attract colonists, despite the fact that much of the land was frozen and inhospitable. Eric's plan worked. In 985 CE, he led a fleet of 25 ships across the Ichi, Denmark Strait. Only 14 made it. The rest were lost to storms and the cruel northern seas. But those who survived founded two main settlements along Greenland's southern coast: the eastern settlement and the western settlement. Life there was grueling. The growing season was short, the winters long, and the terrain unforgiving. Yet the Norse endured for centuries, raising cattle and sheep, trading furs and walrus ivory, and maintaining contact, however limited, with both Iceland and Norway. Greenland became the westernmost outpost of Norse civilization, a frontier community bound together by kinship, Christianity, which eventually took root even here, and the dream of sustaining life at the edge of the known world. Eric himself remained a figure of prominence until his death, though it was his son, Leif Erikson, who would push the boundaries of Viking exploration even further, to a land west of Greenland that would one day be called Vinland. But before that chapter unfolds, it's worth pausing on what these Western journeys represented. They were not mere accidents of navigation or desperate escapes from legal punishment. They reflected a deep-rooted cultural impulse to sail where others feared, to settle where no one else dared, and to forge communities in the margins of the earth. Iceland and Greenland were not just places on a map. They were manifestations of the Norse worldview, built on adaptability, resilience, and a fierce desire to shape destiny with one's own hands. In the cold winds of the Atlantic, the Viking heart found both challenge and meaning. Around the turn of the first millennium, a new journey began, one that would push the Viking frontier to its furthest western edge and place Norse boots on the soil of a continent yet unknown to the rest of Europe. That voyage belonged to Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. and it would carry the Viking legacy beyond the glaciers of Greenland to the wooded coasts of Vinland, a land we now believe to be part of Newfoundland, Canada. Leif had grown up amidst the severe climate and rugged independence of Greenland, a settlement forged by his exiled father's daring. But even Greenland, for all its challenges, was no longer the edge of Norse ambition. According to the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, two rich, if sometimes conflicting, Icelandic sources, Leif learned of a mysterious land to the west from a sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had sighted distant shores after being blown off course on a voyage from Iceland. Unlike Bjarni, who never set foot on this new land, Leif resolved to explore it. Sometime around the year 1000 CE, Leif outfitted a ship with a crew of about 35 men and set sail from Greenland. His journey followed a string of stepping-stone islands that mirrored what scholars now understand to be an accurate approximation of North Atlantic geography. Leif's first stops were Helluland, likely Baffin Island with its flat rocks and icy terrain, and Markland, thought to be the forested coasts of Labrador. Finally, he reached a more hospitable place, described in the sagas as rich in grass, salmon, and grapes. He named it Vinland, land of wine, though it is widely believed this referred not to cultivated grapes, but to wild berries like gooseberries or crowberries. The precise location of Vinland has long been debated, but the only confirmed Viking site in North America lies at Lens-aux-Meadows, at the northern tip of Newfoundland. Discovered in the 1960s by Helge and Anne Stein-Ingstad, this archaeological site provided material confirmation of the Viking presence in North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Excavations revealed the remains of sod-walled buildings, ironworking sites, and Norse-style artifacts, including a ring-headed bronze pin used for fastening cloaks. Radiocarbon dating places the site around the year 1000, perfectly aligning with saga accounts. What's remarkable about Lens-aux-Meadows is not just its existence, but what it represents: an intentional expedition to establish a foothold across the Atlantic. This wasn't merely a passing camp, it was a functioning settlement site complete with workshops and planned structures. Evidence of iron smelting, an advanced skill unknown among indigenous peoples of the region at the time, further confirms the Norse origin of the site. Despite its promise, however, the Vinland settlement was short-lived. According to saga tradition, tensions with local indigenous groups, referred to as skrælings in Norse texts, grew rapidly. These hostilities, combined with the logistical challenge of sustaining a transatlantic colony and internal disagreements, eventually drove the Norse to abandon the site. Vinland, for all its riches and promise, was too distant, too vulnerable, and too isolated to endure. Yet the very fact that they reached it, navigating without compasses or maps, relying instead on sunstones, coastal memory, and an intimate knowledge of wind and wave, speaks volumes about the courage and navigational genius of the Vikings. Their longships were engineering marvels, long, shallow-drafted vessels capable of cutting across oceans and slipping up shallow rivers alike. These ships were powered by both oars and sail, flexible enough to withstand Atlantic storms, yet swift enough for river travel deep into foreign lands. With no charts to guide them, Viking sailors read the sea, watching the flight of birds, the color of the water, the feel of the currents, and the echo of distant shores in the wind. The voyage to Vinland marks one of the most extraordinary feats of pre-modern exploration. It demonstrated not only technical skill but also a mindset unafraid of the unknown. For the Vikings, the world was not closed but open-ended, a vast, unfinished map waiting to be filled by those willing to brave its edges. Though the Norse would not remain in North America, the memory of that journey endured in saga and soil. Long after Leif Erikson's ship returned to Greenland, the knowledge that they had touched another continent remained. Today, Leif stands as a symbol of Viking daring, an explorer who crossed an ocean with nothing but wood, wind, and will. And in Newfoundland's windswept northern reaches, where sod ruins sleep beneath the grass, one can still imagine the flicker of Norse firelight, brief but unforgettable, on the edge of the New World. To truly understand the Viking world, one must look beyond their battles and seafaring adventures and into the rhythms of their daily life. A world of longhouses warmed by firelight, fields tilled under the northern sky, and skilled hands crafting ships that would sail beyond the known world. Viking society was not solely defined by conquest. It was a rich tapestry of community, domestic resilience, and intricate craftsmanship that allowed their civilization to flourish from Scandinavia to distant shores. The heart of a Viking community was the longhouse, a sturdy, elongated building with walls made from timber or wattle and daub, and roofs thatched with straw or covered in turf. These dwellings often stretched between 15 and 75 feet in length, depending on the status of the household. Inside, families shared a communal space where livestock might shelter during harsh winters, food was prepared over central hearths, and stories passed from one generation to the next. There were no private rooms as we know them today. Instead, sleeping spaces were arranged along the walls, divided by wooden partitions or curtains. Viking longhouses were not merely shelters. They were social and economic centers. In many cases, they doubled as workshops, with looms for weaving, tools for woodworking, and spaces for metalworking. It was in these longhouses that women wove cloth from wool sheared from sheep raised on surrounding pastures, and where artisans shaped iron into tools and weapons. The layout and durability of these homes reveal much about the Viking way of life. Practical, communal, and deeply rooted in the landscape. Surrounding these homes were farms, which formed the backbone of Viking subsistence. Despite their reputation as warriors and raiders, most Vikings were in fact farmers. They raised cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats. They cultivated barley, oats, rye, and root vegetables, and they hunted and fished to supplement their diets. Farms were often passed down through generations, forming tight-knit, kin-based settlements. Land was not only a source of food, but of identity and status. A man's wealth was measured not by coin, but by land and livestock. Essential to Viking society was the art of shipbuilding, an endeavor that combined engineering prowess with the cultural spirit of adventure. Vikings constructed their ships from oak and pine, using iron rivets and hand-forged nails. Shipbuilders crafted keels, that allowed longships to glide through shallow rivers as easily as across open seas, and flexible hulls that could endure crashing waves without breaking. Shipbuilding was not merely a profession, it was an expression of Norse ingenuity and freedom. A well-crafted longship was both a weapon and a symbol, enabling expansion, exploration, and connection with faraway lands. Within this society, women held a position of unexpected strength and autonomy, especially when compared to other medieval cultures. Norse women could own property, inherit land, divorce their husbands, and conduct business in their own names. When men were away on voyages, it was women who managed farms, oversaw trade, and enforced household law. Their presence was not confined to domestic life. It extended into legal, economic, and even martial arenas. One legendary figure who embodies this strength is Lagertha, a woman celebrated in saga literature as a warrior, wife, and ruler. According to the 12th century chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, Lagertha fought alongside the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok and led her own forces in battle. While the historicity of Lagertha is debated, her existence in Norse legend reflects the cultural memory of powerful women who defied the gender norms of later medieval Europe. Women also played a central role in spiritual life. The vulva, or seeress, was typically female and held a position of reverence, guiding communities through visions, prophecies, and rituals. Through her, women influenced both the practical and metaphysical dimensions of Viking society. From farmsteads tucked between fjords to bustling harbours echoing with hammers and saws, Viking daily life was built on cooperation, resilience, and the seamless blending of work, belief, and family. It was in these quiet endeavours, in the weaving of cloth, the carving of hulls, and the tending of fields, that the strength of Viking society took root. And it was the balance between domestic endurance and outward ambition that enabled their culture to reach from icy homelands to distant coasts across the seas. While the Viking Age is often told through the lens of longships and conquest, much of its soul lived in the quieter moments, in the laughter of children playing outside the longhouse, the rhythm of feasting halls echoing with poetry, and the firm but communal voice of law spoken beneath the open sky. Viking society was structured not just by axes and ambition, but by customs, storytelling, and a deep reverence for craft and order that shaped every layer of life. Children were not just passive observers in this world, they were expected to contribute from a young age, learning the roles they would eventually carry into adulthood. Boys were trained early in farming, crafting, sailing, and sometimes warfare. They were given small axes or bows suited to their size and taught to fish and row. Girls learned spinning, weaving, tending livestock, and managing the household economy. Yet childhood also had its moments of joy. Simple wooden toys, carved animal figures, and games with stones and bones have all been uncovered in archaeological sites across Scandinavia. Education was oral, passed down in the form of stories, proverbs, and direct instruction from elders. There were no schools, but the longhouse was its own kind of classroom, one steeped in heritage, expectation, and love. In the evenings, especially during the long, dark winters, feasting and storytelling were vital to the social fabric. The great hall was not just a dining space, It was the heart of cultural life. Meals included stews of meat and root vegetables, loaves of barley bread, smoked fish, and ale brewed from honey or grain. Feasting was a communal event, often marking harvests, weddings, or victories. It was also a space where elders recounted family histories and bards, called skalds, recited complex poetry. These skalds were revered not only for their entertainment, but for preserving the memory of heroes, gods, and ancestors. Their verses, passed down orally, formed much of what would later be recorded in sagas. Storytelling had a practical role as well. Norse culture did not rely on written law codes early in the Viking Age. Instead, they preserved laws through oral tradition, delivered and remembered by special legal speakers known as law speakers or logsögumæður. These individuals would recite laws at public assemblies, most notably the Althing in Iceland or local things across Scandinavia. Justice was a community affair. Disputes were settled through negotiated settlements, and honor was maintained, not through prisons, but through compensation, known as vergild, man price. This system of oral law allowed flexibility, but also demanded a sharp communal memory and a high value on reputation and fairness. Viking society also found identity in its exceptional craftsmanship. Artisans in towns and rural settlements alike demonstrated astonishing skill in shaping tools, weapons, jewelry, and household goods. Blacksmiths using iron from bogs or imported ingots forged the iconic Viking sword, a weapon that was both functional and symbolic. Swords were often inscribed with runes and inlaid with silver or gold, passed down as heirlooms and carried into battle not just for use but for pride. Axes, more common and affordable, were no less carefully made. Beyond weapons, jewelry was widespread among both men and women. Bracelets, brooches, rings, and amulets often bore intricate patterns of interlaced beasts and symbols from Norse myth. These items were not only decorative, but served as markers of status and belief. The Mjolnir, Thor's hammer pendant, for example, was a popular symbol of pagan faith even as Christianity spread. Perhaps the pinnacle of Norse engineering, however, was in ship design. The longship was a marvel of both form and function, light, enough to carry across land, narrow enough for shallow rivers, but strong and fast enough to cross open seas. Every curve of the hull and every rib of the ship was crafted with a mix of intuition, tradition, and precise skill. Shipbuilders knew which trees bent best for keels and how to overlap planks to create a watertight but flexible vessel. These ships allowed the Vikings not only to raid and trade, but to settle, explore, and connect far-flung communities across Europe and the North Atlantic. Together, these elements, children raised in tradition, communal storytelling, laws spoken beneath the sky, and crafts honed by hand and fire, formed the foundation of Viking daily life. It was a life that balanced hardship with celebration, violence with order, and mythology with deeply practical wisdom. In every ship sailed and every story told, the Vikings carried forward a culture as rich and resilient as the fjords they called home. To understand the Viking Age, one must grasp not only the tools the Norse wielded in combat, but the mindset that guided their hands. War was not a constant, but when it came, it was deeply bound with ritual, status, and legacy. The Viking warrior was not merely a raider or pirate. He was a product of a culture that revered bravery, remembered ancestors in verse, and believed that death on the battlefield could open the doors to eternity. And so, through the clang of metal and the cresting waves beneath their ships, the Vikings carved out a name feared across Europe and beyond. At the core of Viking warfare were their weapons, simple in appearance but devastating in use, designed as extensions of the warrior's own strength and character. The most iconic of these was the axe. Unlike the heavy two-handed axes of later centuries, Viking axes were versatile, short-handled for close combat or long-hafted for cleaving through shields. Some were single-bladed, others had intricately inlaid heads with decorative patterns, especially among wealthier warriors. For many Norsemen, the axe was not only affordable but symbolic. A common tool turned into a powerful weapon. More prestigious, however, was the sword. Viking swords were typically double-edged, straight-bladed, and about 90 centimeters in length. Forged from high-quality iron, they were often enhanced through pattern welding, a process that twisted together different metals to create a blade both beautiful and strong. A Viking sword was a status symbol, often given names like leg-biter or shadow of woe, and passed down across generations. These blades might be etched with runes or inlaid with silver, and their hilts were custom-crafted for their owners. Only the wealthiest and most renowned warriors carried swords, and their presence in a grave was a sign of high honor. Spears were also widely used, thrusting spears for close combat and throwing spears for ranged attacks. Lightweight and deadly, they allowed Viking warriors to fight in tight formations or initiate attacks from a distance. Many sagas mention the opening of battle by casting a spear overhead in honor of Odin, a ritualistic invocation of divine support. The shield, too, played a crucial role, not only as defense but as a symbol of unity. Viking shields were round, made of layered wood, and typically about 80–90 centimeters in diameter. They were rimmed with leather or metal, and often painted with geometric or mythic designs. In battle, these shields could be locked together in a shield wall, a disciplined formation that formed the backbone of Viking tactics. Behind this wall, warriors could strike, defend, and maneuver with both chaos and cohesion. These tools of war came to life through raiding parties, small bands of warriors that formed the backbone of early Viking expeditions. Contrary to modern notions of chaos and pillage, many raids were carefully organized with clear objectives and structured leadership. A chieftain or jarl would gather a crew, often from his own kin or allies, and set out to raid monasteries, coastal towns, or trading posts. The targets were chosen for their wealth, their lack of defenses, and their political significance. Raiding expeditions might last weeks or even months, depending on the reach of the voyage. Supplies were packed, scouts were sent ahead, and retreat plans were often in place. While violence was certainly part of the process, it was not wanton. Many raids involved negotiations, ransoms, and the threat of force more than battle itself. What made Viking raiders especially formidable was not just their weapons, but their mobility and surprise. This mobility came thanks to the greatest symbol of Norse power, the longship. Crafted from oak and built with overlapping planks, longships were engineered for both speed and stealth. They had a shallow draft that allowed them to sail not only across the sea, but far up narrow rivers. A longship could be pulled ashore quickly, enabling lightning-fast attacks and equally swift retreats. With sails and oars, Vikings could row silently at night or harness the wind during long voyages. The dragon-headed prows of these ships became icons of fear in Europe. When a longship appeared on the horizon, coastal villagers knew what was coming. Yet the same ships that brought terror also brought trade, migration, and eventually settlement. They were the beating heart of Viking expansion, enabling warriors to strike from Ireland to Russia, from France to North Africa. In these weapons and ships, we find more than just tools. We find echoes of a warrior code, one that prized courage, loyalty, honor, and the glory earned not just by living, but by dying well. Viking warfare was brutal, yes, but it was also bound by values that shaped their society, their sagas, and their place in history. Among the fiercest and most enigmatic figures of Viking warfare were the berserkers, warriors who, according to saga and lore, entered a trance-like fury before battle, becoming seemingly impervious to pain and fear. The term berserker likely stems from the Old Norse berserker, meaning bare shirt, a reference to the animal pelts these fighters often wore. Legends describe them as howling like wolves, biting their shields, and charging into combat with wild, supernatural strength. Though the historical accuracy of their legendary rage remains debated, it is clear that some Viking warriors were set apart as elite combatants, members of warrior cults or personal bodyguards, who trained in ways that bordered on ritualistic. These berserkers were not a horde of madmen, but were likely high-status individuals trained to terrify enemies and protect kings or jarls in battle. Some scholars suggest they may have used natural substances, perhaps psychoactive mushrooms or herbs, to induce their frenzied state, though this remains speculative. Others view their rage as psychological conditioning, cultivated through ritual, belief, and years of hardship. Whether myth or reality, the berserker symbolized something profound in Viking culture. A being who rejected pain and fear, channeling chaos into strength. Alongside the berserkers were other elite warrior bands such as the Ulfhednar, who dressed in wolf skins and are said to have served Odin directly. These cult-like groups did not fight simply for loot or conquest. They fought to fulfill a higher, often spiritual calling. Their training emphasized endurance, silence, discipline, and a mystical connection to animals and gods. In their minds, battle was not just a human affair, it was a divine test, a stage upon which destiny unfolded. This brings us to the Viking understanding of honor, fate, and death, concepts central to their warrior code. Vikings believed that each person's life was governed by wyrd or urda, a fate spun by the Norns, mystical weavers who shaped the destiny of all beings. This fate could not be escaped, only met with courage. To die in bed from old age was seen as a lesser end. To fall with a sword in hand, however, was to ascend to greatness. A warrior who died nobly might find himself in Valhalla, the great hall of the slain, where Odin welcomed heroes to feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok. This vision of the afterlife, of continual battle, meed and glory, was not a mere myth. It was a worldview that shaped how Viking warriors faced death. Others might join Freyr in Folkvanga, another realm for the honored dead, reflecting the nuanced spiritual landscape of Norse belief. The common thread was this: death, if met with dignity and valor, was not the end, but the beginning of an eternal saga. Because death held such meaning, funerals were profound, communal rituals. A fallen warrior's body was washed, dressed, and laid with care. Depending on status and region, the burial might take different forms: cremation atop a pyre, interment in a burial mound, or, in the most iconic practice, a ship burial. In these, the deceased was laid in a boat along with prized possessions, swords, jewelry, food, and sometimes sacrificed animals or even servants. The ship, a symbol of the journey between worlds, might be set alight and pushed into the sea, or buried beneath an earthen mound shaped like the hull of a boat. One of the most famous such burials is the Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway in 1904. It contained 2 high-ranking women and a wealth of artifacts, showing that honor and elaborate funerary rites were not limited to male warriors. Ship burials communicated wealth, status, and spiritual belief in the most dramatic way possible: a physical vessel to carry the soul to the realms beyond. These funerals also served the living. They reaffirmed alliances, passed on legacies, and anchored memory in place. They reminded the community that life was fleeting, but honor was eternal. In this code, this fierce loyalty to kin, fearlessness before fate, and reverence for the afterlife, we find the heartbeat of Viking identity. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a mirror of the soul. The long ship was not just a vessel of war, it was a bridge to immortality. In living bravely and dying well, the Viking warrior sought not just victory but remembrance, and it is in that remembrance, through sagas sung and graves uncovered, that they continue to speak across the centuries. By the close of the 10th century, the Viking world was no longer the same wild frontier that had once erupted across the coasts of Europe. The age of surprise raids and mythic heroes was giving way to something quieter, more permanent. An age of kings, treaties, and temples, built not to Odin but to Christ. While Viking raids continued sporadically into the 11th century, a transformation was underway from within. The Norse people, once defiantly pagan, began to turn toward Christianity. Not all at once, not without resistance, but with a momentum that would gradually reshape their world. The conversion to Christianity among the Norse was neither sudden nor universally embraced. It happened in waves, over the course of generations, and often for political or practical reasons rather than purely spiritual ones. The first encounters with Christianity occurred during Viking raids and settlements in Christian lands. As Norsemen travelled through Anglo-Saxon England, Frankish territories, and the coasts of Ireland, They came into direct contact with monasteries, churches, and Christian customs. Some Vikings began to adopt certain elements of the faith through trade or diplomacy, while others converted for survival, agreeing to baptism as part of treaties or ransom arrangements. But these were often surface-level conversions. For many early Norse converts, Christianity was a tool, a way to access political alliances or avoid retribution. Pagan rites continued alongside new Christian symbols, and in many areas, old and new beliefs blended together. It would take the actions of strong rulers to tip the balance decisively. One such figure was Harald Bluetooth Gormson, King of Denmark in the mid to late 10th century. Harald is remembered today not only as a powerful monarch, but also as a pivotal figure in Scandinavia's Christianization. According to the EEA runestone he erected at Jelling, now one of the most famous artifacts of the Viking Age, Harald won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The claim was grandiose but not without truth. Harald's conversion, according to legend, came after witnessing a Christian priest named Poppo perform a trial by ordeal, carrying red-hot iron without injury, which Harald interpreted as divine intervention. Whether this tale is myth or historical truth, Harald's shift to Christianity was politically astute. By embracing the new faith, he aligned himself with the powerful Christian kingdoms of Europe, strengthened his internal rule, and took a step towards centralizing authority over a once fragmented land. In practical terms, Harald began replacing pagan shrines with churches and commissioning missionaries to preach among the Danes. He also issued coinage with Christian crosses and made efforts to integrate the church into his rule. Yet even under Harald, resistance persisted. Many Danes, particularly in rural areas, clung to the old gods. The Viking worldview, with its cycles of fate, hall of heroes, and sacred groves, did not yield easily. Still, Harald's actions set a precedent. The kings who followed him, such as Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later St. Olaf in Norway, continued the work of Christianization with increasing vigor. Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled Norway in the late 10th century, was known for his aggressive campaigns to destroy pagan temples and force conversions, sometimes under threat of violence. He built churches, invited foreign clergy, and used Christianity as a means to unify and expand royal authority. These changes were more than symbolic. Christianity introduced new systems of law, literacy, and governance to the Norse world. Latin texts replaced oral tradition in some areas, and Christian clerics became advisors to kings. The transition also reoriented Norse identity, moving from warrior bands and clan loyalty toward kingdom building and continental diplomacy. The gradual conversion to Christianity did not mean the Vikings suddenly ceased to be Norse. Many traditions persisted beneath the surface. The Norse still sang of Odin and Thor in their sagas, told tales of Valhalla, and carved dragon heads onto their ships. But the meaning of these stories changed. Where once they were religious truth, they now became cultural memory, echoes of a past that was fading into legend. Thus, the end of the Viking Age did not arrive with a single battle or edict. It came like a tide, rising slowly as kings like Harald Bluetooth reshaped the spiritual landscape of Scandinavia. In the quiet of new churches built upon ancient grounds, the wild gods of the north were laid to rest, not forgotten, but transformed. The world of the Vikings, once bound by ship and saga, was now tethered to the cross and the crown. As Christianity spread across the north, so too did the idea of centralized royal power, a force that would eventually silence the Longships and forge the fragmented Norse world into lasting kingdoms. During the earlier centuries of the Viking Age, Scandinavian power was dispersed among jarls, petty kings, and clan leaders. Loyalties were personal and regional, and violence was a common tool of succession. But by the 11th century, that landscape began to shift. Stronger kings emerged in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, each consolidating authority, Christianizing their realms, and laying the foundations of modern nation-states. In Denmark, the process had begun under Harald Bluetooth, but it was his son, Sweyn Forkbeard, and later Knut the Great, who brought Danish power to its apex. Knut ruled over not just Denmark, but also England and Norway, creating a vast North Sea empire held together by both Viking legacy and Christian kingship. Danish power was no longer expressed through raids, but through taxes, alliances, and royal decrees. The Danes transitioned from plunderers to governors. Norway followed a bloodier path to unification. Kings such as Olaf Tryggvason and Saint Olaf Haraldsson, forcefully imposed Christianity and crushed local resistance, including rival chieftains who clung to the old ways. Saint Olaf, in particular, became a symbol of Christian monarchy, and his death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 cemented his legacy. Afterward, his cult grew rapidly, supported by the Church, and became central to Norwegian identity. Norway's unification was thus not only a political process, but a spiritual transformation, binding together land and faith under a Christian crown. Sweden was slower to centralize, in part due to its inland geography and strong pagan resistance in areas like Uppsala. However, kings such as Olof Skotkonung, Sweden's first Christian king, began minting coins with Christian symbols and opening diplomatic relations with Christian Europe. By the mid-11th century, the Swedish monarchy had established enough control to limit internal warfare and promote trade with the rest of the continent. While Sweden maintained a dual religious identity longer than its neighbors, the tide eventually turned, and Christian kingship took hold. These shifts in leadership and faith coincided with the waning of Viking raids abroad, culminating in one of the most symbolic battles in European history, the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. On September 25th of that year, Harald Hardrada, the warrior king of Norway, sailed to England with a massive army. He was lured by claims to the English throne, but his ambitions were also rooted in the old Viking spirit, a belief that glory and conquest still lay beyond the horizon. Harold's army achieved early victories, but at Stamford Bridge they met the forces of the English king Harold Godwinson, who marched north with incredible speed. In the fierce battle that followed, the Norwegian army was caught off guard, many without armor, and brutally defeated. Harald Hardrada was killed, struck down in the thick of the fight. His death is often seen by historians as marking the end of the Viking Age, for he was the last great Norse warrior king to launch an invasion in the classic Viking style. Symbolism was clear. The old way of life, of sea kings and glory raids, could no longer compete with the organized armored kingdoms of medieval Europe. Just weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson himself would be defeated at Hastings by William the Conqueror, ushering in a new era of centralized feudal monarchies and shifting the focus of European power yet again. Yet even as the age of the Viking raid ended, its legacy transformed Europe in lasting ways. The Norse had reshaped political borders, founded cities like Dublin and Kiev, and established trading routes that connected the Arctic Circle to the Byzantine Empire. They introduced seafaring innovations, left their mark on law and language, especially in regions like northern England and Normandy, and blended their myths and bloodlines into the cultures they once raided. In England, the Danelaw left behind legal concepts and place names still in use today. In France, the Normans, descendants of Vikings, would go on to conquer not just England, but territories in Italy and the Holy Land. In Russia, Norse-descended rulers became the foundation of the Kievan Rus. And across the North Atlantic, traces of Viking presence endure in Icelandic sagas, Greenland ruins, and the archaeological site of L'Anse aux Meadows in Canada. So while the Viking Age may have ended, it did not vanish. It simply evolved, its energy absorbed into the very fabric of medieval Europe. The fierce independence, navigational genius, and cultural richness of the Norse people live on, not in flaming longships on the horizon, but in the quiet persistence of history. Though the Viking longships no longer glide across the seas and the gods of Asgard are no longer worshipped in sacred groves, the legacy of the Norse world echoes all around us, in the words we speak, the laws we uphold, the maps we navigate, and the stories that still capture our imagination. Far from being a closed chapter of distant history, the Vikings left behind a living imprint on the modern world, one woven through the fabric of language, legal systems, and the very idea of exploration. One of the most lasting influences of the Vikings can be found in language, particularly in English. During their extensive settlement in the Danelaw regions of England, Norse-speaking peoples intermingled with Anglo-Saxons, leading to a profound linguistic exchange. Many everyday English words have roots in Old Norse, terms like sky, egg, window, knife, husband, die, and even the pronoun they. These weren't borrowed from afar. They entered the language through direct contact, through neighbours, trading partners, and intermarriage. Place names across England still carry the Viking stamp. The suffixes by, thorp, and toft are of Norse origin, signalling former Viking settlements. Towns like Derby, Grimsby, and Scunthorpe trace their names directly to Scandinavian roots. Even the days of the week reveal a linguistic legacy. Tuesday from Tyr, Wednesday from Odin Woden, Thursday from Thor, and Friday from Freya all stem from Norse deities embedded quietly into the rhythm of modern life. Beyond vocabulary, the Vikings influenced law and governance, especially in regions where they established permanent settlements. The Norse concept of thing, a public assembly where free men debated laws, resolved disputes, and elected leaders, was a powerful institution that prefigured more modern democratic practices. In Iceland, this tradition took the form of the Althing, established around 930 CE and still functioning today as the national parliament, making it one of the oldest continuous parliamentary bodies in the world. Norse law was largely oral, but remarkably structured. It relied on oaths, witness testimony, and public reputation. Legal disputes were resolved not by imprisonment, but through restitution, arbitration, and, in serious cases, outlawry. These early systems helped influence the development of legal customs in Scandinavia and had a knock-on effect in territories where Vikings ruled or mingled with local populations. The emphasis on communal decision-making, responsibility, and personal honor would echo in later legal traditions across Europe. In the realm of navigation and exploration, the Viking legacy is equally profound. The Norse were among the greatest seafarers of the pre-modern world. Their longships, capable of both oceanic voyages and river travel, were technological marvels, lightweight, symmetrical, and swift. They allowed the Vikings not only to raid, but to trade, settle, and explore across vast distances, from Baghdad to Newfoundland. Their navigational skills were honed without compasses or modern instruments. Instead, they used sunstones, star positions, wind direction, watercolor, and the flight patterns of birds. These techniques, passed down orally, formed an intuitive and resilient knowledge system, one that enabled them to cross the North Atlantic centuries before Columbus. Their voyages to Vinland, documented in the Icelandic sagas, and the archaeological site at Meadows, offer a quiet testament to their daring spirit and practical genius. And while the swords and sails of the Vikings may have faded, their mythology has surged back into global consciousness in modern times. The Norse gods, once whispered to in sacred groves, are now summoned on cinema screens, video games, literature, and tattoos. Thor wields his hammer in Hollywood blockbusters. Odin's wisdom and Loki's mischief populate comic books and fantasy epics. The tree Yggdrasil, the concept of Ragnarok, and the vision of Valhalla inspire everything from heavy metal lyrics to motivational speeches. This resurgence is not just entertainment, it's a reflection of enduring fascination. Norse mythology, with its flawed gods, inevitable doom, and poetic beauty, speaks to something primal in the human condition. The tension between fate and free will, the nobility of struggle, and the mystery of the unseen. Unlike the more orderly pantheons of Greece or Rome, the Norse cosmos is wild, tangled, and tragic, a universe in which even the gods must one day fall. And in that drama, many modern readers and viewers find something deeply moving. So while the Viking Age officially ended in 1066, its spirit endures in our languages, in the laws that govern our societies, in the tools we use to explore the world, and in the stories we tell around fires or screens. The Norse legacy lives on. What began as whispers across the North Sea has become part of a global conversation, reminding us that the sea kings and skalds of the North still have something to teach us about courage, about community, and about the tides of history that never fully recede. While the longships have vanished from the horizon, and the sagas have passed into legend, the genetic legacy of the Vikings remains etched into the bloodlines of countless people across Europe. Far from being a transient wave of raiders, the Norse left behind a biological imprint that quietly persists in the DNA of modern populations, particularly in Britain, France, Russia, and Iceland. Genetic studies conducted in recent decades have revealed fascinating traces of Viking ancestry, evidence of both their far-reaching settlements and the integration that followed their incursions. In Britain, especially in regions once part of the Danelaw in the north and east, modern DNA shows clear markers of Scandinavian lineage. Areas such as Yorkshire and the Orkney and Shetland Islands exhibit high frequencies of Norse genetic traits, affirming historical accounts of Viking colonization and intermarriage. The Vikings were not just seasonal invaders. They stayed, farmed, raised families, and contributed to the emerging English population. Names, customs, and bloodlines blended over generations, and the descendants of Norse settlers quietly became part of the evolving British identity. In France, the legacy is particularly strong in Normandy, whose name itself derives from Northmen, a testament to Viking roots. The Duchy of Normandy was established in 911 CE when the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, granted land to the Viking leader Rollo and his followers. Over time, these Norse settlers adopted the local language and customs, but maintained strong, familial structures, martial traditions, and maritime skills. Their descendants, the Normans, would go on to change the course of European history, most famously through William the Conqueror's victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. In this way, Viking bloodlines and ambition threaded themselves directly into the noble houses of medieval France and England. In Russia, the genetic imprint of the Vikings is tied closely to the Varangians, Norse adventurers who traveled down the vast river systems and established ruling dynasties in Slavic lands. The founding of Novgorod and Kiev under leaders such as Rurik and his successors marked the beginning of what would become the Kievan Rus, a federation of states that laid the groundwork for modern Russia and Ukraine. Genetic studies show that while the ruling elite were of Norse origin, they gradually intermarried with local Slavic populations. Even today, markers of Scandinavian ancestry can be found in certain Russian and Ukrainian populations, particularly in the northwest, but perhaps nowhere is the Viking genetic legacy more concentrated and intact than in Iceland. Settled primarily by Norse seafarers beginning in the late 9th century, Iceland became a haven for families escaping the growing power struggles in Norway. These early settlers brought with them not only their livestock and tools, but also their language, laws, and bloodlines. Modern genetic analyses of Icelanders reveal a relatively homogeneous population with strong Scandinavian ancestry, preserved due to centuries of geographic isolation. Interestingly, while most male lines trace back to Norse roots, a significant portion of maternal ancestry comes from the British Isles, suggesting that many of the women who settled in Iceland came from Ireland or Scotland, likely as captives or wives brought from raiding expeditions. This unique genetic tapestry is a living record of Viking mobility, conquest, and community building. Beyond genetics, the enduring fascination with Norse culture reflects how the Viking story continues to evolve in the collective imagination. From scholarly research to popular media, Viking imagery captivates audiences across the world. The allure is more than just the thrill of axe-wielding warriors. It's rooted in a complex admiration for exploration, resilience, and mythic richness. Modern television series, novels, video games, and films have brought Norse culture into the mainstream, rekindling interest in the sagas, gods, and historical figures of the Viking Age. Academic interest has grown as well, with universities offering courses in Old Norse, rune reading, and medieval Scandinavian lore. Museums from Oslo to York host Viking exhibits that attract millions. Reenactment groups stage longship launches and warrior festivals. The fascination spans continents, proving that the Viking legacy is not merely regional, it is universal. This resurgence has also led to a reassessment of the Vikings' role in history. Once stereotyped as ruthless plunderers and destroyers of civilization, modern scholarship paints a more nuanced picture. The Norse were indeed fierce in battle, but they were also skilled traders, bold navigators, gifted poets, and pragmatic settlers. They carried goods, ideas, technologies, and people across vast distances, creating networks that stretched from North America to Central Asia. In redefining them not just as raiders but as explorers, we acknowledge their extraordinary contributions to the shaping of the medieval world. They were men and women who dared to cross oceans with no maps, who adapted to foreign lands with resilience, and who fused their traditions with those of the peoples they encountered. The Viking spirit was not only about conquest, it was about curiosity, adaptability, and the pursuit of meaning in an unpredictable world. Today, the Viking Age may lie behind us by 1,000 years, but its echoes remain vivid. In stone carvings and surnames, in genomes and legends, in the rhythm of the weak and the path of a sailing ship, the Norse legacy endures, quietly powerful, like a distant wave breaking on a forgotten shore.